Don't let me down.
Anyway, she didn't split the Beatles. The Beatles were drifting apart on their own.
The world saw the music, the friendship, the magic. But what they didn't see was the quiet hatred, the whispered betrayals, the moments that shattered it all. Days before he was gunned down, John Lennon dropped a bombshell. He didn't point fingers. He exposed wounds. Was it Paul McCartney? Or was it a silent war that had been building for years? The Beatles didn't fall apart because of fame. They fell apart because of something far more sinister, a secret only Lennon dared to say out loud. And once you hear it, you'll never see them the same again. To understand how everything unraveled, we need to revisit where it all began. When four young lads from Liverpool came together, not just to form a band, but to create a brotherhood that would redefine music. The Beatles' rise and bond. Every legend has a beginning, but the rise of the Beatles feels more like fate than coincidence. It's almost strange to think that the most famous band in history started as a group of teenagers just trying to make some noise in Liverpool. They didn't know they were building a cultural revolution. At first, they were just four boys chasing a sound, and, in the process, finding something much bigger. It began with John Lennon. He was sharp, rebellious, and a bit rough around the edges. He formed a skiffle group called the Quarrymen in the mid-1950s. At one of their gigs in 1957, a mutual friend introduced him to a younger kid named Paul McCartney. McCartney was quieter, more polished, and already miles ahead musically. He impressed Lennon with his ability to tune a guitar and play Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock. And just like that, Lennon invited him into the band. That single decision changed everything. Soon after, McCartney brought along his friend George Harrison. Harrison was only 14, but his guitar skills couldn't be ignored. He was calm and focused, the kind of kid who let his playing do the talking. Eventually, after a few test runs, Harrison became a regular part of the group. The final piece of the puzzle, Ringo Starr, joined later in 1962, replacing Pete Best on drums. Starr wasn't flashy, but he had perfect timing, a laid-back charm, and the kind of humor that helped keep tensions low. Well, at least in the early days. What made them special from the beginning wasn't just their individual talent, but how those talents fit together. Lennon and McCartney formed the creative heart of the band. They wrote songs side by side, often literally sitting across from each other, trading lines and melodies. They came from different worlds. McCartney was methodical and structured. Lennon was raw and instinctual, but that contrast made them stronger. They were often called two halves of the same mind, and in those early years, it really felt that way. Harrison added depth. He didn't speak up much, but he paid close attention. You could tell he was always watching, learning, waiting for his moment. And Starr? Starr brought rhythm, stability, and a sort of easygoing energy that made the rest of them feel like things would be okay, even when chaos was brewing. Back then, there was a real bond. If one of them messed up on stage, the others covered. It wasn't just a band, it was a brotherhood. Before they were legends, these young men were trying to find the right name. They went through a few rough drafts like the Quarrymen, Johnny and the Moondogs, even the Silver Beatles. But it wasn't quite right. Then came the twist. Inspired by Buddy Holly and the Crickets, they liked the idea of an insect-themed name. At first it was just Beatles, but leave it to John Lennon to take it one step further. He suggested changing the spelling to Beatles, with beat as a clever nod to the music they were playing. And just like that, the Beatles were born. But then, the world found them. By 1963, the Beatles were no longer just a local act. With the release of Please Please Me, they exploded into the mainstream, and everything changed. Beatlemania swept across the UK and quickly bled into America. Suddenly, they were being chased through airports, mobbed at concerts, and scrutinized in ways no other band had ever experienced. Fame hit like a tidal wave. On one hand, it was exciting. They were finally getting everything they had worked for. But on the other hand, it introduced a pressure none of them could have prepared for. They were no longer just four boys with guitars. They were cultural icons, expected to be perfect every second of the day. It was during this time that the cracks started to show. Not big ones, but small differences in how they each handled the spotlight. McCartney thrived in it. He leaned into interviews, took control in the studio, and cared deeply about maintaining their musical direction. Lennon, however, became more cynical. He struggled with the constant attention and started questioning what it all meant. Harrison began to quietly resent being overlooked as a songwriter, and Starr, while still dependable, sometimes felt like an outsider. Still, in those early years, the unity was strong enough to carry them. They pushed each other creatively, experimenting with new sounds, instruments, and ideas. Albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver weren't just records, they were statements. You could feel their bond in every note, even if the foundation was already beginning to shift. Looking back, it's easy to romanticize the beginning, and maybe we should. Because before the egos, before the outside influences, before the slow drift that pulled them apart, the Beatles were just four young guys who genuinely loved making music together. They had no idea what was coming. The fights, the silence, the heartbreak. All they knew was that, for a while, they were better together than apart. But even the strongest bonds bend under pressure. And in the case of the Beatles, that pressure was coming fast. Everything looked perfect from the outside. One unstoppable band, and the world at their feet. But beneath all that success, small things started to feel different. Not broken, at least not yet, but not quite the same either. Cracks begin to show. When the Beatles first burst onto the global stage, they seemed unstoppable. From the outside, it looked like four young men living the dream. Sold-out arenas, screaming fans, constant #1 hits. But underneath the surface, the pressures of fame and the sheer weight of their success were already starting to wear them down. Touring had been a whirlwind. Non-stop flights, hotels, interviews, and performances. Day after day, city after city. Thousands of fans losing their minds just to catch a glimpse of them. At first, it was exhilarating. But that adrenaline rush faded fast. By 1966, the excessive touring had chewed them up. The live shows became almost pointless. They couldn't even hear themselves over the screaming crowds. The thrill of performing was replaced by exhaustion, frustration, and sometimes even fear. They were trapped in their own success, unable to enjoy the very thing they had built together. It wasn't just the noise and the pace that were getting to them. Each of them was changing, evolving. Lennon, always the rebel at heart, started gravitating toward more abstract, experimental work. He was looking for something deeper, something that challenged the norms. McCartney, meanwhile, was holding on to melody and structure. His songwriting leaned toward accessible pop, often meticulously arranged and carefully polished. He saw beauty in clarity and simplicity, while Lennon was reaching for rawness and disruption. It wasn't that one was better than the other, they were just drifting in different directions. And that creative tug-of-war, once a dynamic source of balance, started to feel like a quiet standoff. At the heart of it all, holding the band together, had been Brian Epstein. Their manager wasn't just the guy making the business deals. He was their buffer, their protector, and in many ways, the glue keeping the personalities in check. Brian knew how to handle the chaos, how to steer them through the insanity of global fame. He believed in them, and they trusted him. But in 1967, Epstein died suddenly from an accidental overdose. He was only 32. His death left a gaping hole, not just in their business, but in their sense of direction. For the first time, there was no one outside the band managing the storm. No one to settle disputes or help them see the bigger picture. Without Brian, they were left to navigate their growing tensions alone, and it showed. After his death, decision-making became a mess. They struggled to agree on how to move forward. McCartney tried to step into a leadership role, hoping to keep the momentum going, but not everyone appreciated that. Lennon, especially, resented what felt like control. The trust that had once come naturally started to erode, replaced by skepticism and second-guessing. At the same time, each member was beginning to look outside the Beatles for creative satisfaction. Harrison, often overlooked early on, was becoming a powerful songwriter in his own right. He was diving deep into Indian music and spiritual philosophy, carving a distinct identity beyond the group. Starr started exploring other projects and gradually voiced his own frustrations about being left out of creative decisions. The unity they once had, those magical days of writing songs side by side, laughing in hotel rooms, sharing dreams, was slipping away. Not in a dramatic explosion, but in small, steady ways. A missed meeting here, a passive-aggressive comment there, more solo work creeping into group projects. The cracks weren't just showing, they were spreading. Still, they kept creating, and somehow, in the midst of all the tension, they recorded some of their most legendary music. But the cost was rising. The differences weren't just artistic anymore, they were personal, deep-rooted. And soon, they'd face a moment where keeping the band together would feel less like a goal and more like a burden. Looking back, it wasn't one single event that broke them. It was a series of slow, subtle shifts: fame, grief, growth, and the realization that maybe, just maybe, they were no longer the same four boys who started out dreaming in Liverpool. Just when it seemed the music might hold them together, something more personal started to pull them apart. The connections outside the band that quietly began changing everything. The influence of outside relationships. By the time the late 60s rolled around, the tight-knit chemistry that had once fueled the Beatles was slowly starting to unravel. Not with a bang, but with a quiet shift. For a band built on unity and shared dreams, this shift was more than just a bump in the road. It was the beginning of a slow and steady realignment. First, let's talk about the person John Lennon met, which caused a bit of distraction: Yoko Ono. When Lennon met Yoko Ono in 1966, something clicked for him. She wasn't just an artist. She was a force, a fresh perspective, someone who didn't care that he was a Beatle. For the first time in a long while, Lennon saw someone who viewed him as John, the person, not just the icon. As their relationship deepened, so did her presence in his creative life. Yoko didn't stay on the sidelines. She sat in on recording sessions, offered her opinions, and eventually became a fixture in the room. That was unusual for the Beatles. Up to that point, the studio was their private zone, their sacred space. It wasn't that the others disliked Yoko personally. It was the disruption to a very specific dynamic that had worked so well for so long. Lennon, however, saw it differently. He had found a new partner, creatively and emotionally, and he wasn't about to shut her out. On the other side, McCartney was finding his own anchor in Linda Eastman. She was a photographer and had a quiet confidence that grounded him. Linda brought warmth, perspective, and a kind of emotional support that McCartney didn't always get within the band. As they grew closer, she became part of his musical world too. Unlike Yoko, Linda wasn't as hands-on during recording, but her influence was no less powerful. She encouraged McCartney's songwriting and, over time, became an integral part of his creative decision-making. When they later formed Wings together, it became even clearer how much he valued that creative partnership. The result caused a shift in allegiances. Where Lennon and McCartney once functioned as two halves of the same mind, now they were orbiting other centers of gravity. Their romantic partners weren't just influences, they were extensions of their identities. What was once us four slowly became me and mine. But then, it wasn't a loss on George Harrison or Ringo Starr either. Harrison had long felt overshadowed in the band, and now with Lennon and McCartney bringing their wives into the fold, the space to contribute was getting even smaller. Starr, known for keeping the peace, tried to stay neutral, but even he could sense the change. The camaraderie was no longer effortless. Well, as usual, the public noticed too. Media headlines zeroed in on Yoko Ono especially. Fans blamed her for the band's growing distance, even though the issues had started well before she entered the picture. But was Yoko Ono really the problem? Because she became the symbol of division, unfairly targeted and misunderstood. Linda got her share of side eyes too, though it wasn't quite as fierce. Still, it was clear that fans wanted the Beatles as they were. Any sign of outside interference was treated like betrayal. But the truth is, these weren't outside interferences. They were natural evolutions. Lennon and McCartney were growing, changing, becoming men who needed something more than the band had to offer. Their personal lives were bleeding into their professional space, not out of disrespect, but because they were human. Over time, what made the Beatles so magical began to fracture. The wives, the girlfriends, the growing families, the changing world views. It all added up. Not in a fiery implosion, but in a quiet, steady pulling away from each other. The group was no longer just four guys making music. It had become four individuals, each with their own lives, values, and people they wanted by their side. And in the middle of all that, the Beatles, as the world knew them, began to feel less like a band and more like a memory in the making. While everyone had their own theory about what went wrong, McCartney gave the world something solid, and it pointed straight at Yoko. Paul McCartney says Yoko Ono was an interference with the Beatles. For years, people outside the Beatles pointed fingers, speculated, and stirred drama. But when McCartney finally spoke about it himself, he didn't sugarcoat it. In an interview years after the breakup, he admitted that Yoko Ono was an interference, not in a cruel or bitter way, just honest, direct, like someone who had finally accepted a hard truth without needing to dress it up. McCartney explained that it wasn't personal and that he had nothing against Yoko. But when she began attending recording sessions and sitting literally between him and Lennon, something shifted. That wasn't how the Beatles worked. Their magic came from a natural back-and-forth rhythm, built over years. You didn't need to speak it, you just felt it. When someone new entered that space, especially during the band's most fragile period, it felt like a disruption. It's easy to assume McCartney was being defensive, but in his words, there's something more nuanced. He wasn't blaming Yoko as the reason the Beatles ended. He was acknowledging that things were already tense, and her presence only made it harder to hold the center. The band members weren't keen on conflict, so they kept their feelings to themselves and carried on, even when Yoko was there. At that point, Lennon was pulling away, emotionally, creatively, even physically. Yoko was his person, and he wanted her involved in everything. McCartney saw it, understood it, and, in his own way, respected it. But he also couldn't deny that something special was breaking apart. And while McCartney might have called her an interference, he also later admitted that maybe the Beatles would have broken up anyway. The band had run its course. They were growing into different people, with different needs. Yoko just happened to be there during the final stretch. Still, it meant something that McCartney said it out loud. After decades of dancing around the subject, he gave fans a little piece of the puzzle. A human answer, not a headline. Just one man reflecting on what went wrong and who was in the room when things started to fall apart. It wasn't until much later, before his death, Lennon started opening up. And when he didn't sugarcoat why the Beatles couldn't stay together. Lennon's painful truth. Why the Beatles couldn't hold it together. By the late 1960s, Lennon had begun to feel like a man trapped inside a machine he helped build. The Beatles had become bigger than life itself. But behind the fame and the headlines was a man who felt like he was shrinking under the weight of the band's legacy. The very thing that had given him global recognition was starting to choke his growth as an individual. Lennon was always the philosophical one, the guy who questioned everything, from society to spirituality to himself. But inside the Beatles, there wasn't much room to explore those questions without stepping on someone else's toes. As the group matured musically, Lennon felt he wasn't being allowed to mature personally. In his own words, "We're all individuals, and in the Beatles we grew out of it. The park was too small." That statement said a lot. The band had once been a safe space, but now it was a tight, confining box. Lennon to be wanted out, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much about becoming who he really was. The pressure to always be on was relentless. It's more like being in your 20s and knowing the world sees you not as yourself, but as a quarter of the Beatles. Lennon often talked about how he lost himself during that time. He once said, "I remember at 16 I still had myself. From 16 to 29 is when it got lost." That's a powerful thing to admit. While the rest of the world was applauding their music, Lennon was quietly drowning in the identity crisis that came with it. He was trying to figure out who he was outside of the band, but every time he looked around, all he saw was the shadow of the Beatles following him. Also, there's more. You know, it's rare for an artist to openly criticize their own work, especially when that work has been celebrated by millions. Yet Lennon, known for his candidness, didn't shy away from expressing his dissatisfaction with certain songs he penned during his time with the Beatles. One such song that he felt particularly disheartened by was Across the Universe. Lennon wrote Across the Universe in 1968, and it eventually found its place on the Beatles' album Let It Be. While he took pride in the song's lyrics, he was notably disappointed with its final recording. In an interview featured in David Sheff's book All We Are Saying, the last major interview with John Lennon and Yoko Ono, Lennon remarked, "It was a lousy track of a great song and I was so disappointed by it." He elaborated that the guitars were out of tune and his vocals were off because he felt psychologically destroyed during the recording process, lacking support from his bandmates. This sense of isolation wasn't an isolated incident. Lennon felt that during the later years of the Beatles, there was a growing emotional disconnect among the members. He believed that Paul McCartney particularly, perhaps subconsciously, would sometimes undermine his songs. Lennon cited "Strawberry Fields Forever" as another example, feeling that the recording didn't do justice to the song's potential. He observed that while meticulous attention was given to McCartney's compositions, his own songs were often approached with a sense of looseness and experimentation, which he referred to as subconscious sabotage. Lennon's candid reflections highlight the complexities of collaborative creativity, especially within a band as iconic as the Beatles. Despite the challenges and his personal disappointments, songs like "Across the Universe" have endured, resonating with audiences worldwide and showcasing the depth of Lennon's songwriting prowess. The band's longtime producer, George Martin, saw it too. He later shared that all four members were ready to branch out and live for themselves. They had been part of something legendary, sure, but that came with sacrifices. According to Martin, they'd always been having to consider the group, so they were always a prisoner of that, and I think they eventually got fed up with it. The fame, the fans, the constant expectations, it had all become too much. But here's the twist. Lennon never wanted the band to fall apart the way it did. He wasn't hoping for drama or bitterness. In fact, he thought they would have handled things more gracefully. He once compared their breakup to a film about Gilbert and Sullivan, where ego and miscommunication got in the way of art. "I really never thought we'd be so stupid, like splitting and arguing," Lennon said, "but we were naive enough to let people come between us, and that's what happened." That one sentence captured so much regret. He saw the cracks, but he hadn't expected the whole house to collapse. What made things even more complicated was the emotional messiness of it all. This wasn't just a business deal coming to an end. It was a group of young men who had grown up together, traveled the world, made history, and then realized they were on completely different roads. Lennon had no beef with growth. In fact, that's all he really wanted. But he didn't want the journey to leave bruises. Sadly, by the time everything unraveled, bruises were everywhere, not just in lawsuits, but in friendships and memories too. In the years that followed, Lennon, McCartney, George, and Ringo slowly began to reconnect, piecing back together some of what had been broken. They were no longer the Beatles, but they were still four guys who had shared something no one else could fully understand. For Lennon, that reconnection mattered. It wasn't about reliving the past, it was about finally being free to be himself, while still holding space for what they had built together. After shaking the world as part of the Beatles, Lennon's life took unexpected turns, yet nothing could prepare anyone for the shocking events that would bring his story to a heartbreaking close. Life after the Beatles and the tragic end. Right after the Beatles dissolved, Lennon focused on his solo career. He poured his heart and soul into music that reflected his own voice, separate from the band's dynamic. Albums like Plastic Ono Band and Imagine became landmarks not just for their sound, but for the raw honesty Lennon brought to the table. His songs were often political and deeply personal, addressing everything from love and family to peace activism. Alongside music, Lennon became a vocal advocate for peace, famously holding bed-ins with Yoko Ono, his wife, as protests against the Vietnam War. These moments showed the world that Lennon wasn't just a rock star. He was a thinker, a rebel, and a man hoping to change the world with words and actions. Speaking of family, Lennon was a father of two. His first son, Julian, was born in 1963 with his first wife, Cynthia Powell. Julian had a complicated relationship with Lennon, especially as the band's fame skyrocketed and Lennon's personal life shifted. Then, in 1975, Lennon and Yoko Ono welcomed their son, Sean. Sean's birth marked a turning point for Lennon. He took time off from his career to focus on fatherhood, stepping back from the public eye to be a hands-on dad. Sean would later become a significant part of Lennon's legacy, a softer, more grounded side to the larger-than-life artist. But then, tragedy struck on a cold December evening in 1980, forever changing the course of music history and heartbreaking fans around the world. On December 8th, Lennon was shot and killed outside his apartment building, the Dakota, in New York City. The exact moments of that day have been etched into the memories of many. Lennon and Yoko had just returned home from a recording session when a man named Mark David Chapman approached Lennon. Chapman had been waiting outside the Dakota earlier that day, and in a chilling act, he fired 5 shots, 4 of which hit Lennon at his back. Lennon was rushed to the hospital but was pronounced dead shortly after. The news shocked the world. The Beatles had been gone for years, but Lennon's killing felt like the loss of a symbol, a voice for peace and hope, brutally silenced. Mark David Chapman, the man who killed Lennon, still remained there, and he was quickly arrested at the scene. His motivations were tangled and disturbing. Chapman later said he was obsessed with Lennon and frustrated by what he saw as contradictions in his public persona. He also claimed that he was inspired by the character Holden Caulfield from J.D. Salinger's novel The Catcher in the Rye. Chapman saw Lennon as a phony, a term used by Caulfield to describe people he deemed insincere or hypocritical. He was particularly angered by Lennon's 1966 comment that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, as well as the lyrics of Lennon's songs God and Imagine, which he felt contradicted the messages of peace and love that Lennon espoused. Chapman believed that by killing Lennon, he would rid the world of this phony and gain recognition for himself. He later admitted that the act was driven by selfishness and a misguided desire for personal glory. The killing wasn't politically motivated or random. It was the tragic result of a troubled mind fixating on an icon. Chapman pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. He has been denied parole multiple times, remaining incarcerated to this day. After Lennon's death, there was an outpouring of grief that extended far beyond music fans. Vigils were held worldwide. At the Dakota, where Lennon had been shot, fans left flowers, notes, and candles. Lennon's body was cremated, and Yoko Ono scattered his ashes in Central Park. A small, dedicated memorial called Strawberry Fields was later created in the park, a peaceful tribute to Lennon's life and ideals. The black and white Imagine mosaic there has become a pilgrimage spot for fans wanting to connect with Lennon's message of peace. Despite the horrific way his life ended, Lennon's death also sparked a global conversation about fame, mental health, and gun violence. People looked not only at the tragedy itself, but at the vulnerability of someone who, for all his larger-than-life presence, was still deeply human. So, when you think about Lennon's journey, it's impossible to separate the man from the music, from the family, and from the way his life was cut short. He ventured boldly into new chapters after The Beatles, finding new ways to express himself and nurture those he loved. His death was a devastating punctuation mark on a story that was still unfolding. Was Yoko Ono really the villain who tore the Beatles apart? Or is there a deeper story behind the band's breakup that no one wants to face? Tell us what you think in the comments. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. For more content like this, tap on the next video on your screen.